Japan, land of legends, land of the rising sun, and Osaka, the site of Expo 70. A wealth of creative energy has gone into planning and construction. This is, in fact, the greatest world exposition ever held. The Tower of the Sun Pavilion successfully combines a presentation of Japan's ancient culture and its modern technological achievements. "25 years after the surrender in 1945, an admiring world saw how Japan had indeed risen from the ashes and become an economic rival to its conquerors and an emerging leader in high-tech industry. A visitor to Japan's astonishing Expo 70 sees the sun rise on another world. Now a worldwide oil crisis threatens Japan's prosperity. As the biggest oil importer in the world, Japan stands to suffer more than any other nation, the British Guardian newspaper pointed out in October. Yesterday in Japan, an economic state of emergency was declared. Oil and electricity supplies to major industries will be reduced by 20% on January the 1st. Jack Russell of NBC reports today from Tokyo.
Prime Minister Tanaka arrived at a critical cabinet meeting on the oil crisis from a hospital where he had been under treatment for a bad cold. The cabinet declared a state of emergency. The government is expected to ban Sunday driving and close gas stations on the weekends. Gasoline rationing is reportedly being considered. Tokyo's nighttime Ginza will suffer. Already some neon signs have been switched off voluntarily. But the government now will order more lights off and close bars, restaurants, and theaters early. Police were already cracking down on business firms which were hoarding fuel for household heating. The government pleaded with the Japanese people not to start panic buying, assuring them that Japan had adequate stocks. But it did not minimize the seriousness of its effect on the economy.
The report adds, now, with the doubling of the oil price, there will be more inflation, more unemployment, and an abrupt end to the Japanese boom. In October, the world's largest oil tanker, under charter to a Japanese company, went into service at Hiroshima. On the very same day, the Japanese oil industry announced preparations for cutbacks. Japan imports 99.7% of its oil from abroad, 83% of it from the Middle East. Most of Japan's industries are powered by electricity, 77% of which is generated by oil-burning steam plants. The oil embargo has had an immediate effect on Japanese life and the economy. There are petrol shortages. There are queues for fuel oil. There's panic buying, especially of toilet paper. It's not yet clear how the Japanese will get out of this crisis. In the past, however, they have shown a remarkable ability to raise their country to world status. The arrival of Commander Perry's US Naval Squadron in 1853 to demand trading rights ended a long period of isolation for Japan. The country was poor and backward compared with the West. Most people were peasant farmers. Then in the 1870s, under the new Emperor Meiji, Japan set itself the task of catching up with the West. Officials set off to visit Europe and the United States and to bring back Western technology. Railways were built. A postal system was set up and mass education was introduced. Japan's first spinning factory with mass production opened in 1872. The navy and army were modernized, so well that Russia was defeated by Japan in 1905. By 1930, Japan had pushed itself into the ranks of the great powers. Nearly half the population still lived on the land, but there was a growing, well-trained industrial workforce. Industrial development was mainly in the hands of a few big firms. Those small traditional industries continued to expand. But the Wall Street financial crash came in October 1929, followed by the collapse of world trade. How could the Japanese recover from such a setback in 1930? Would a collapse of world trade wipe out Japan's modern industries? Japan's industrial leaders turned to making even cheaper goods, undercutting competition. Listen to an American view of this period in a propaganda film released in the 1940s.
From the factories of Osaka, the mills of Tokyo, the chemical plants of Nagoya, the steel mills of Iwata, the shipyards of Nagasaki came the economic bullets. But these belching factories in the cities were not the real machinery behind Japan's trade war. For here was the real machinery. The slums of the cities, where 64% of Japan's products were made in small backroom factories employing 5 people or less. There are hundreds of thousands of these factories in the home where father, mother, and children work in semi-slavery. Taking advantage of these low labor costs, the industrialists of Japan knew they could undersell every other nation on earth, and they did. All over the world, they dumped their cheap labor products. And to their dumping, they added piracy. Countless patented articles were manufactured and sold throughout Asia under their American names. The 2 best-known American spark plugs. Genuine old Scotch whiskey was made in the distilleries of Osaka. Matches made in Kobe were labeled made in Sweden. They undersold silk to the silk-producing Italians. They undersold England's cotton goods in the home of her own cotton industry. They undersold beer to the beer-producing Germans. American toothbrushes, retailing at 35 to 50 cents each, were copied in Japan to retail in American chain stores at 10 cents each. They even undersold us with our own American flag. And with the money accumulated in foreign countries with these cheap labor exports, did they in turn buy automobiles, ice boxes, or food? Did they erect better homes for the Jap workers or improve their living conditions? No, indeed. Instead, they imported oil, scrap iron, tin, rubber, aluminum, and secretly built up their powerful war machine. A fanatic nation turning its sweat into weapons for conquest. Sweat for guns. Sweat for planes. Sweat for ships. Sweat for war.
Japan looked to Asia for a solution to its problems. It seemed to offer large areas for Japan's population to settle in, surplus raw materials for Japan's industry, and an immense market for its exports. And, under the Emperor Hirohito's divine rule, the Japanese were led to believe they had a mission to liberate Asia from Western colonial rule. Asia for the Asians was the slogan. In 1931, the Japanese army seized Manchuria, where Japanese companies already ran the railways and controlled the mines. At the League of Nations, Western powers condemned this takeover of Chinese territory. So Japan left the League. By 1935, in a British newspaper, the cartoonist David Lowe was warning that Japan wanted to be a world power. Two years later, in 1937, Japan began all-out war in China, still proclaiming its aim was to liberate the country from Western domination. By 1941, a large area of China was under Japanese control. Japan next went to war with Britain, France, and the Netherlands, which all had colonies in East Asia. And without warning, Japan attacked the United States, which opposed Japanese expansion in China. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 severely damaged the United States Pacific Fleet. This Dutch poster shows how Japan then extended its empire by conquest throughout Southeast Asia. At first, the Japanese seemed almost unbeatable. Listen to this American propaganda film.
His uniform is ill-fitting, his appearance unsoldierly, even comic according to Western standards. At drill, he may lack precision. But he is hard. He is able. He knows his job. His endurance is phenomenal. He'd just as soon go over a mountain as around it. He lives on rice and fish, or occasionally rice and meat, but often on rice alone. And he's proud of it. He is prouder still of the fact that to be a soldier is the highest human achievement in Japan. He has been trained to be a soldier almost from birth, and into his tough little mind has been drilled and hammered the fanatical belief that Japanese are descendants of gods and destined to rule the earth and all who live on it.
But the greater strength of the Allies pushed back the Japanese forces. By 1945, they were in retreat on all fronts. Allied bombers attacked industrial and strategic targets in Japan, reducing 100 cities to ashes. The war then ended suddenly when atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Russia's declaration of war on Japan forced it to surrender in August 1945. Was this the end of Japan as a world power? Because of wartime propaganda, many ordinary people feared that an Allied army of occupation would rob and torture them. Allied views of the Japanese were also based on propaganda, like this British cartoon, which portrayed them as treacherous and subhuman. In fact, the Allied occupation of Japan surprised both sides by being both peaceful and productive. Even the cover of the American Marines magazine Leatherneck in September, celebrating Japan's surrender, showed this amazing change in the wartime view of the enemy. The scale of Japan's defeat completely destroyed most Japanese people's faith in the military and all for which they stood. This made it much easier for the Japanese to accept the new democratic constitution drawn up by the occupation authorities and announced by the emperor in the Diet, the Japanese parliament. The constitution was the most important part of a package of reforms which had far-reaching effects on Japan's economy. By giving up Japan's right to make war, the constitution freed the country from spending on armed forces. The money saved could be invested in industry. The constitution gave workers the right to strike. This made the development of a team spirit among the workforce an essential task for the foreman and management as a whole. And new skills gained during the war could now be turned to peaceful purposes. Books and teachers were purged. The whole education system was reformed. More children could now go on to high school and university and so prepare for the new technology. Agricultural reform gave land to peasants. This gave them incentives to improve their farming methods and higher incomes to spend on industrial products. The big industrial combines which had supported Japan's war effort were to have been broken up by the occupation authorities. But as the communists came to power in China, occupation policy went into reverse. The Americans thought of Japan less as a defeated enemy to be punished, and more as a useful ally to be encouraged and protected. With the help of General MacArthur, Supreme Commander Allied Powers, Japanese business benefited from access to US markets, aid and technology. But how has Japan been able to become a world economic power instead of just getting back on its feet? The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 gave a great boost to Japan's recovery. Japanese factories won valuable contracts to supply the United Nations fighting forces. United Nations troops on leave came to Japan to spend their pay. By 1955, Japan's economic output had passed its pre-war peak. In 1960, Prime Minister Ikeda announced that the income of the average Japanese family would double within 10 years. In fact, it was achieved 3 years ahead of target. Japan's economic success is all the more incredible when we remember that the country has very few raw materials and almost no energy supplies. It was a combination of good luck and good management which brought about Japan's economic miracle. The luck consisted of low prices for energy and raw materials and the general growth of world trade throughout the 1950s and 60s. The good management rested on close links between government and business. Governments helped business by means of low taxes. Tariffs were put on imports to fend off foreign competition. Another important factor was the mechanization of agriculture. More food could be produced by fewer people, so workers could be attracted into fast-growing industries without having to pay them high wages. Success, but at what cost? Governments have been determined to push the growth of industry as fast as possible, and so have done little to protect the environment. Industries like steel and chemicals, which produce poisonous gases and harmful wastes, have been allowed to build their works where it has suited them. In some areas, there have been deformities and deaths from industrial pollution which poisoned the water people drank, the food they ate, and the air they breathed. At a more everyday level, Tokyo's growing garbage mountain has seemed to be a symbol of a society in which production has been starting to get out of hand. So prosperity has brought problems within Japan. But it has also made a big impact overseas, where Japanese high-quality exports have been flooding the markets. In the last 2 years, both Britain and America have put restrictions on Japanese imports. However, the immediate problem is the oil crisis. Will the energy-saving measures be enough? Is more nuclear fuel the answer? But is this a real option in a country which alone has suffered nuclear attack? In a country with severe earthquakes, could the Japanese really turn to nuclear fuel? In the long term, what is the way ahead?